In a somewhat fiery interview with the chief officer of the Oceanic to a reporter from the Daily Alta on the 23rd of August, 1888. He issued the following statement to the press. Quote, "The men of the Chester," he said, "say they lowered our boats. Do you think it at all likely that a true sailorman will leave his own vessel, clamber up into a strange ship, and proceed to lower her boats? The men who say they did that also claim it was fully 25 minutes before the Chester sunk. If that was so, why did they not stay on their own vessel and lower their own boats?"
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The chaotic collision of the city of Chester.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The city of Chester was built in 1875 in Pennsylvania, but she was almost immediately bought by the Oregon Steamship Company and brought to San Francisco in order to run the route between Portland and San Francisco. The 1,106-ton iron-hulled steamship made her debut on the route in 1877. She would continue on the route even after the Oregon Steamship Company merged with the Oregon Steam Navigation Company and became the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company. Though she would remain under the ownership of this company, she would eventually be chartered by the Pacific Coast Steamship Company and put on the San Francisco to Eureka route instead. On the 22nd of August, at 9 in the morning, the city of Chester departed from San Francisco with 106 passengers on board and 47 members of the crew, sailing under the command of Captain Wallace. The ship was departing in a heavy fog, but that was not particularly unusual, and none of the passengers thought it to be alarmed by it. The crew was on alert and commented on it, but that was all. The city of Chester traveled slowly due to the lower visibility, feeling her way through the fog, as Captain Wallace would refer to it, and sounded her whistle regularly. Though the city of Chester had originally been designed to carry over 300 passengers between first class and steerage, she had less than half of that as she departed San Francisco. Most of the passengers stood on the deck as they sailed from the city, and it was reported that the city of Chester felt crowded as a result. According to some passengers who had been on deck as the ship traveled down the channel, the fog grew less dense and sporadic. So sometimes visibility was still very low, but other times they could see the shoreline. As the fog broke up, the weather also became more chilly. Many of the passengers fled the deck to find warmth in the cabins. Captain Wallace, however, remained on the bridge, watching his ship travel through the cold and foggy morning. While the city of Chester was departing from San Francisco, another ship was approaching the city. The Oceanic was another iron-hulled steamship, though at 4,000 tons, she was significantly larger than the city of Chester was. She was sailing with a crew of 103, under the command of Captain Metcalf. The crew was predominantly Chinese, and she was carrying over 1,000 passengers on board, most of whom were also Chinese. But she was sailing for the British, Occidental, and Oriental Steamship Company. The Oceanic departed from Yokohama on the 8th of August, and had just completed one of the fastest trips ever done on the route between Yokohama and San Francisco, by making it in 14.5 days. Captain Metcalf had handed the steering of the vessel over to Captain Meyer, a local pilot, to bring them into port, but he remained on the deck, as was his practice when entering and leaving port. As the two ships drew near one another near Fort Point, they became aware of the fog whistle of the other ship. The Oceanic signaled to the city of Chester first, issuing 2 blasts on her whistle, which was a signal to tell the other ship that she had turned to starboard. The city of Chester responded with 2 blasts on her own whistle. Once again, the Oceanic signaled with 2 blasts, and the city of Chester again responded in the same way, a signal that she would turn to port. Strangely, however, the helmsmen of the city of Chester both said that they had not received any orders to change the course of their ship, and so they had not done so. Indeed, presumably under the influence of the current, the city of Chester was slowly turning to starboard instead. In the meantime, both Captain Metcalfe and Captain Meyer of the Oceanic reported that they had turned their vessel to starboard and given the orders to stop the engines after the first exchange of whistles. Captain Wallace would also say that, due to the thick fog, he and his crew had not been able to see where the other ship was, while some of the passengers on deck would say that they had been able to see it 500 yards away as it approached them. The crew of the Oceanic would also testify that they had been able to see the city of Chester half a mile away, which meant plenty of time for the 2 ships to avoid one another. No matter what the conditions were, the 2 ships were soon so close together that there was no more time for maneuvering, and they were on a direct collision course. With the accident imminent, both captains gave the order to reverse their ships. There would be questions later that would place blame on both captains for this chain of events. The Oceanic crew said that they had seen the city of Chester for some distance, and had seen that she was not changing course in spite of the signals that were being blown on her whistle. This being the case, they should have maneuvered so they would be further out of her way. In the meantime, the crew of the city of Chester said that they had not seen the other ship at all, even though passengers on their ship said it was fully visible. They also did not stop their ship until they could figure out the other ship's position, and they were sending signals that suggested they would change route, but they were not. It is perhaps significant that the people on the city of Chester who said that the fog was still very thick were all officers, while the crew and passengers all said that it was much thinner now, and visibility had greatly improved. Captain Wallace would also later say that from the sound of the whistle, they had believed that the other ship was on their port rather than on their starboard, and that they would pass her safely, but that does not explain why he then issued the 2 whistles in response to the Oceanic signal. Without either ship giving the order to reverse until far too late for it to have any effect, the city of Chester passed across the bows of the Oceanic. The bow of the Oceanic plunged 10 feet into the port side of the city of Chester, about 20 feet from the ship's bow. The significantly larger Oceanic tore through the side of the city of Chester, ripping through cabins and causing the wood of the upper works of the injured ship to fly in all directions. It would later be testified by one of the mates of the Oceanic that the very fact that the Oceanic had not simply passed through the much smaller city of Chester was proof that they had slowed down and attempted to avoid the collision. Captain Metcalfe also thought quickly and gave the order for his ship to stop reversing. Instead, he did his best to hold his ship in place so the bow of the Oceanic would plug the hole that had been made in the side of the city of Chester. It was his hope that the Oceanic might be able to hold the city of Chester up until they could make an orderly evacuation of her. But the city of Chester was swiftly filling with water in spite of his efforts. The panic among the passengers on both vessels was immediate, adding to the danger of the situation. The Oceanic was hardly damaged at all. Only a few bow plates were injured in the collision, and the water that was entering the ship was well within the abilities of the ship's pumps. But due to having over 1,000 passengers on board, all of whom were alarmed by the collision, they had a struggle bringing everything under control. Still, as quickly as possible, the Oceanic launched boats and began to start rescue work. Some of the more nimble people on board the city of Chester did not require rescue, thanks to the 2 ships remaining together. They simply climbed up to the deck of the Oceanic. Among the people who climbed onto the deck of the Oceanic was Sam Halton, who had been at the wheel of the city of Chester when the collision occurred. He and the other men at the wheel had remained in place for a minute after the accident, but after receiving no further orders, they had both abandoned the wheel and decided to save themselves. By the time Halton made the deck of the Oceanic, people from the city of Chester were already in the water, and he began to throw ropes over the side of the ship for people to cling onto, though he could not say that he saved many people that way. On board of the city of Chester, the order was given to lower the ship's boats, but there was very little time. Only 2 boats were launched before the city of Chester went down. Second Mate Lundin managed to get 1 boat lowered with the help of some of the crew, and they began to pick people out of the water. Second Mate Lundin did not get into the boat himself, however, remaining with the ship to see what he could do to help. He and other members of the crew began to pass passengers who were on the deck over the railing and onto the deck of the Oceanic. The alarm was also sent below to warn anyone below decks to come up as quickly as possible. It was hard to tell in the confusion who had reached the deck and who had never had the chance. A passenger named Davis, who had been traveling with his family, had done everything he could to save his loved ones. He had first found his 23-year-old niece and passed her over the railing of the Oceanic to the safety of the deck. He had then gone to carry his sister to the same place, only to be trampled underfoot by panicked and stampeding passengers when the ship had suddenly given a lurch. It was acknowledged by everyone on board that this was the ship's final death throes. But Davis would later say that he thought that the sinking of the ship had been sped up by everyone rushing to one side in their panic. Both Davis and his sister would reach safety, though his sister became very ill due to the experience and could not be removed from the Oceanic even after it reached port. But they lost their brother and his small daughter in the disaster. Both Captain Wallace and Second Mate Lundin went down with the city of Chester, but then rose to the surface again. Captain Wallace rose under a piece of wreckage which turned out to be part of the ship's pilot house. He clung to it, and Second Mate Lundin witnessed him placing a life preserver, presumably one of the ones that the Oceanic had been throwing into the water, around a woman and helping her to the side of the Oceanic. Captain Wallace would eventually be picked up by a tug that had rushed to the scene of the accident to try to save the people in the water. Second Mate Lundin, meanwhile, found a man who was struggling in the water and brought him to the boat that he had helped launch before the city of Chester had gone down. It was reported that 3 more times Second Mate Lundin had jumped from the boat, and each time he had returned with someone who had been close to drowning and pulled them into the boat. It was not just the officers of the city of Chester who went down when the ship sank beneath their feet. Third Mate Bridget of the Oceanic had been in charge of 1 out of 5 lifeboats that the Oceanic had dispatched to help. His boat had unfortunately been too close to the city of Chester when it went down, and his boat was capsized. He and his crew managed to regain the deck of the Oceanic, but one of the passengers who they had saved was lost in the process. When Third Mate Bridget opened his pocket watch and found it destroyed by the water, he also provided the best evidence to be had later as to the response of the crew of the Oceanic to the disaster. It was undeniable that Halton, one of the men who had been at the wheel of the city of Chester, had indeed lowered one of the 5 boats of the Oceanic and helped with the rescue, but the rest of his story was soon proven to be unreliable, as were the stories of some of the other members of the city of Chester's crew. Halton in particular would say that it had taken the Oceanic an hour to lower their boats, though other members of the crew were more generous in their statements of 20 minutes or half an hour, and that the boat that he had lowered along with the other members of the city of Chester's crew had been the first that had departed from the Oceanic. Third Mate Bridget's broken watch had stopped when the third mate had ended up in the water with the sinking city of Chester, however, and gave a precise time. The city of Chester had gone down 6 minutes after the collision, and it had taken the Oceanic 4 minutes to launch their boats. Passengers from the city of Chester would testify that they had seen the crew of the Oceanic chopping away the ropes that held their boats in place with axes, showing the same level of urgency as the crew on board of the city of Chester. Called out in particular for his heroism was Ah Lung, a member of the Oceanic's crew, who had seen a little girl of 2 in the water and had rushed to save her. Ah Lung had his legs badly damaged in the process, but he had kept the 2 of them afloat until they could be pulled out of the water. On becoming aware of the fact that he was now considered a hero by the general public, Ah Lung was able to negotiate an extended stay in the United States as his reward, even though he had come on the Oceanic as a crew member and not as an immigrant, and therefore did not have any immigration paperwork. It would take some time for the people who had been lost to be entirely realized, in part because of the multiple ships that had come to rescue people from the water. The first mate of the city of Chester, for instance, was numbered among the lost, only to call the morgue personally and tell them that he had left from the Chester, not gone down with it, and had been picked up by a small tug. When the final number was realized, it was discovered that 16 people in total were gone, and that most of those who had been lost were steerage passengers, though some of the first-class passengers and crew members had also been lost. Some of those who fell victim to the disaster succumbed to their injuries after being rescued, and it was said that the smoking room on the Oceanic looked like a hospital as the ship entered quarantine. Assigning the blame for the collision was difficult for the public, as well as for the government. There were swirling and contradictory statements from all parties, from the officers, crew, and passengers of both ships, and determining the truth was an unenviable task. Captain Wallace, Captain Metcalfe, and Captain Meyer were all experienced captains with years of experience and good reputations, which led to even more confusion as to how such a thing could have happened. Unfortunately, the accident also became a piece of ongoing debate filled with deep prejudice and misinformation about whether or not crews made primarily of people from China should be allowed at all. Many newspapers of the time published articles and statements from people from the city of Chester, stating that if the crew had not been from China, everyone on board the city of Chester could have been saved, and that the crew of the Oceanic had refused help in the rescue and had been disorganized. It was a claim that the officers of the Oceanic violently opposed, as did some of the officers from the city of Chester, pointing to the proof that they had launched their boats quickly as evidence of a well-disciplined crew, as well as the heroism of Ah Lung. Unfortunately, the damage was already done, and the story of the cowardice of the crew of the Oceanic would be brought to the floor of Congress as fuel for a debate on whether or not crews from China were to be allowed. Fortunately, word reached California about what had been said, and letters were sent from involved parties correcting the record and assuring Congress that the crew of the Oceanic had only behaved as sailors ought to have, and that they had taken a very active role in the rescue work. It is also fortunate that the 2 inquiries that took place regarding the collision of the city of Chester and the Oceanic paid attention to more important matters than the nationality of the crew. One of the inquiries was by the United States authorities. Captain Wallace argued before them that the accident had been unavoidable due to the conditions that were present, but the inquiry found fault with the actions of the captains on both ships. They censured Captain Meyer and Captain Metcalfe for not having sounded warnings and taking precautions when they became unsure of what the city of Chester was doing. And they censured Captain Wallace for not slowing his ship further or slacking the ship's speed when he became aware that he was approaching another ship in a fog. There was nothing that they could do to Captain Meyer, since his license was through the British government. But they did revoke Captain Wallace's license, both as the ship's master and as a pilot. The British government, in their hearing on the matter, was much more lenient, and they did indeed blame the conditions that existed at the time of the accident, saying that the strong tide and the fog had combined to bring the two ships dangerously close together. This ignored some of the testimony that had been presented to them by experienced pilots, who said that they would never have attempted to bring a ship as heavily laden and as large as the Oceanic into San Francisco in the conditions that existed at the time, because they would consider it too dangerous. The city of Chester was considered past all salvage. Considering how damaged the ship had been, as well as how deep the water was, it was considered an impractical project. There was some talk about dynamiting the hull, but since she had sunk at such a depth, even this was unnecessary, since she posed no risk to other shipping. A diver did claim to make the dive to inspect her, but said that he had seen remains where her steerage had been, which had horrified and spooked him, and he had returned to the surface and had not made the dive again. In 2013, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration discovered the wreckage of the city of Chester sitting upright at 216 feet deep, the fatal gash in her side still visible. The ship was declared a protected site, as well as a grave, by the state of California, which made it clear that just as in the past, there would be no plans to disturb the resting place of the city of Chester.
For more information, please see the Daily Alta, California from August 23rd, 1888, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.